Greetings from the Cosmic Horror. The stars are right once again, and the great old ones allow us to talk about for 30 plus minutes H.P. Lovecraft. The horror writer is a genre unto himself. I'm your cosmic host, Mark Griffin, executor of the Lovecraft estate on Yawgmoth, joined in by two from the material world, David Guffey, a professor at Miss Pataki University, and Richard Wilson, who still hasn't gotten past Appendix A in his Dungeons and Dragons book. For today's episode, our guest is Jeff and Hoy of the Appendix N Book Club. Welcome, and thank y'all for joining us.
Thank you for having us on.
Yeah, very excited to be here.
Yeah, I must say that most book clubs I've heard form either discuss things like the literary merits of a certain novel, or they might even say, like, what make a great movie. But y'all have a book club for a completely different reason.
We do. So the book club originally started when I created the Dungeon Crawl Classics New York meetup group. It was a meetup group designed for people who wanted to play DCC RPG, the Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game. But because Dungeon Crawl Classics was really inspired by the Appendix N, for those who are listening who don't know what that is, in the 1979 Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, there's a bunch of appendices in the back, and one of them is Appendix N, which is where Gary Gygax, the co-creator of D&D and the author of that book, made a list of the books that inspired D&D and that he recommends we read for our inspiration. Dungeon Crawl Classics was really inspired by this list, went back and reread those books before designing the game. So we decided to start an in-person book club to read these books and discuss it. I created this thing. Hoy was coming to each and every one. And at a certain point, Hoy was like, we should do something with this. So we decided to make a podcast around it.
That's a great idea.
Right. And for, I don't know, what's the first 20 SoundCloud episodes? I think we had one guest in there just as a trial, but it was mostly just the two of us talking originally.
Yeah, because for the most part, we were just getting caught up on the books we'd already read for the book club and just getting them onto digital tape.
Right. But
we've had decided to go back and record like the books you'd already read, and then catch.
Yeah. And then but then we stayed pretty true to the format of reading books that were directly cited or authors that were cited. But then around episode 100, is that right, Jeff? We changed the format a little bit. And so, and by that point, we had a pretty solid listenership, larger than I would have expected for something pretty niche. But there's still a ceiling on that, I would suppose. But we're getting a little burned out with some of the sameness of the time period and some of the things that we're dealing with. Which are, I don't personally offended, but, there's a lot of sexism, there's casual racism in some of these texts and just kind of datedness. And so we decided to change it up slightly by opening up to our Patrons to, we would give like themed selections of like 4 books that they could vote on. A lot of them are still Appendix N books, but sometimes we'll bring in something else that is outside of that envelope, and that has really helped mix it up a little bit. And then lately we've just gone to, for our patrons, we've slightly slowed down on just because real life is caught up. And so we're now down to 1 book roughly a month, as opposed to the 2 we were doing for a while, which is definitely a recipe for burnout. And we started doing a movie club for our patrons. So as of this recording, we've just did one earlier today for The Hills Have Eyes, which the patrons voted on. That was a blast. That's the first time I've seen that. So thank you for recommending that, Jeff.
Yeah.
So is the movie club have anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons? Or is it something completely different?
Well, the format is the same. So the format of the show that we do is the shows are never longer than an hour. And the first half of the episode, we talk about the book from a literary perspective, what worked, what didn't work, what we liked, what we didn't like, etc. And then the second half of the episode, we talk about how this book could have inspired early D&D and or how we can use this game to inspire our own gaming. So with the movie club, which is just a patron exclusive thing, like that's not being released to our regular stream, but it's the same format where we spend half an hour chatting about what we thought of the movie and then half an hour talking about how we can mine this movie for gaming inspiration.
So what's the name of it? Is it the Appendix N as well, or is it?
Well, we just kind of casually call it the Appendix N Movie Club, but it's just available if you're a member of the Appendix N Book Club Patreon, and then that's just something that we drop in there.
Right. Without being too mercenary about it, it's just only $1 a month if you want to get in on that. So,
this is your spotlight, so you can, it's like you're the featured guest.
I mean, you can go on at higher tiers if it gives you a slightly more priority as for, because we have limited slots available for our Zoom discussions and stuff like that. And so But it was always really important to me and Jeff that the main gist of our show remain completely free in public. And so the actual episodes that we have with our guests are always going to be free. It's the stuff in the Patreon will be something like the movie club, or just having some of the listeners in the Patreon come on to sort of a pre-show of ours so they can talk about the book. And so that's what we do there.
And so how did y'all become interested in Dungeons and Dragons?
For my part, well, Jeff, you go ahead.
Oh, sure. I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got into it when I was 10. I had a neighbor who had these really cool books and invited me and my friend Josh to play. And I just remember like looking through the books and just like immediately like my brain was just lighting up with excitement. I was born in 1980. So in 1990, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons second edition was brand new. So that's what I was looking at. I was looking at those second edition books with those big, like full color Clyde Caldwell pictures throughout. And I just remember just thinking they were the coolest thing. And I got really into that from the ages of 10 to 12. Then when I was 12, I was 6'3" with dyed black hair, and I started smoking cigarettes. I was a 12-year-old who's a little ahead of my time. And I decided that I was too cool for Dungeons and Dragons, and I started playing Vampire the Masquerade. So I played that from like 12 to 14. Then from 14 to 18, I was just too cool for RPGs at all. I just didn't want to be associated with them. But then when I turned 18, I'm just like, get over yourself. You love RPGs. And I've been playing RPGs consistently since then. So from 10 to 43, I only took a 4-year break.
What about you, Holly?
I took a longer break from active gaming, but I actually got into D&D right on the cusp of when it was switching from original D&D to advanced D&D. So the Holmes Blue Box was starting to show up in my school. This must have been around 4th grade or so. So I heard about that. You would see the original white box, and the supplements were still on sale, like Greyhawk and Eldritch Wizardry and stuff like that. But also my dad at the time had a publishing contract with Random House. So at one of the visits to his editor here in New York City, at that point I was living in Boston, came down, and I was sitting outside the editor's office while they were having the meeting. At the end of the meeting, the editor came out and said, "Hey, I'd like to show you something if you would like." And he gave me 3 brand new copies of each the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, the original printing, so not the orange spine ones. And so that was it from then on, as far as D&D. But it
was like Christmas time there.
Oh my, unbelievable. It didn't actually end up with me getting at one point, because in 7th grade I was just being very slack with homework and actually having my D&D book locked in a closet for a week. But I loved all those games. Classic Traveler was happening, and there were a couple of kids who were older, and one kid I was friends with, his older brother was a really great dungeon master. And so to bring it around to sort of the subject of what we're doing today, I remember, do you guys remember, that wasn't Different World, Space Gamer magazine, which was originally owned by Metagaming. So, and then Steve Jackson, who would later on designed GURPS, was the editor of that, I believe. It had a pre-release article on the first edition of Call of Cthulhu, the RPG, and I saw the reproductions of the art in there, and said to my friend's older brother, "You have to buy that and run that for us." And to this day, Call of Cthulhu is right up there as my favorite RPG, in all of its flavors. So I don't play as anywhere near as often as I would like to, but that also I think I remember hearing, I think on your first episode, Deities and Demigods was also my entry to Lovecraft directly. So I saw that, and I wouldn't read Lovecraft for at least another couple of years. But I was in Missouri visiting the family that had sort of put up my father when he first came up to the States, and one of the brothers in the family had the Lancer edition of The Color Out of Space, and that was the first Lovecraft story I ever read, was Color Out of Space, and that freaked me out, but also couldn't stop. So
that's a killer story to start off with Lovecraft and all that.
Yeah. And then later on, I'll tell you the story that made me tap out on Lovecraft for a few years, just because I got way too freaked out. but anyway, so that's sort of my origin story there. And I don't know.
And similarly, the way that I got into Lovecraft was through Call of Cthulhu. That's how I found out who he was and how I got interested in figuring out more about this person.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people who play Call of Cthulhu who have never really ever read any Lovecraft, and so did he inspire you to read Lovecraft, the game itself?
Eventually it did. I did play it for a while without having read any. But actually, I really hadn't read any, I don't think, until we started this project. That's when I actually first started really reading this stuff. So that would have been a little over 6 years ago.
And I guess when y'all were like first getting your D&D manuals, did y'all actually like pay attention to the Appendix N back then, or was it something y'all glossed over?
No, I think I think some of the writers they were still pretty available at the time, so you could definitely get the Ace/Lancer paperbacks of the Conan books. The Fritz Leiber Ace paperbacks were still available, so a lot of that stuff was still available in the air. But not, I don't recall ever actually reading Appendix N and saying these are the authors. I think again, a lot of the Appendix N authors I really got to through Deities and Demigods. So like the Fritz Leiber stuff is in the Deities and Demigods. All the Elric stuff is in that printing. It's since the subsequent printings that were taken out of, but that original first printing had that stuff before they had their little disagreement with Chaosium, and then had the stuff removed. So
yeah. And for me, I mean, I started with the second edition of the game, so I didn't see the Appendix N until when fourth edition D&D came out, and I, like many others, really did not enjoy the fourth edition of the game, and I, like many others, got really interested in early D&D. So this was probably like 2004, 2005-ish, maybe. And that's when I was kind of pulled into the first edition stuff and saw the Appendix N and thought it was fascinating and really wanted to read more of this stuff. But prior to actually seeing the Appendix N, I think all I had read from it was the Lord of the Rings trilogy, some Conan stories. And I remember an ex-boyfriend of mine had told me I would really like Stafford and the Grey Mouser. So I checked out a few of those stories. That was the extent of what I had read from the Appendix N prior to actually intentionally going into this project.
And so when did y'all first become aware of the Appendix N? Was it through Dungeon Crawl?
Yeah, for me, it was during the OSR revival. For those listening, OSR stands for Old School Revival. And that was when people were really getting into old school D&D because they didn't like current D&D. It started with third edition, but in third edition, I was still fully on board for D&D. I didn't lose faith in D&D until fourth edition. But it was through that movement that I got interested in older D&D, which then got the Appendix N onto my radar.
Mm-hmm. I pretty much stopped playing D&D, I think, more or less around the time the Orange Spine books rolled out, definitely by the time second edition rolled out. So I was still playing role-playing games for a long time. But then after college, I didn't have a group. So up through college, and then that not in college, I would play with my friends when I got back home, during the breaks. So I was reading, that's around the late 90s is also when the Delta Green RPG or Delta Green supplement to Call of Cthulhu came out. So that really brought the stuff into like the late 20th century. And that was around the same time as both Twin Peaks and X-Files. So I was going in sort of that more sort of modern direction with that. Still reading Lovecraft at that time. But your direct question as to Appendix N, I'm sure I must have been aware of it, and I had read a lot of the authors. But really just like honing in on the concept of Appendix N was probably around 2012 or 13. I sort of started reapproaching D&D, but through the weird fantasy lens of the game Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And so I was buying up some of that, and I was starting to look at some of the blogs because that was really sort of the peak time of the OSR blogs. Was around, say, from 2009 through 2014 or so, just before the arrival of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So there were definitely some people talking about Appendix N. Unfortunately, one of the people who was the most popularizer of that is very, for lack of a kinder word, quite reactionary about it. And there's a very reactionary movement within D&D people are like, this is the one true text. Anyone who's playing is wrong, and anyone who wants to argue for DEI in D&D is wrong. That's not where we're at. Jeff just talked about it, right? I'm a person of color. We're LGBT, all these other people. It's there for everybody. So that was a very important point that we made when we started the podcast and this project, is that we're going to be looking at some of the stuff, a lot of which is questionable by modern standards, we're not going to judge it too much, but we're going to not look past it. We're going to acknowledge all that stuff, but we also accept that people who are going to be uncomfortable with it are not being asked to read this stuff, right? We will sort of chew through it, digest it. If it interests you, come and take a look, but with the warnings that, we all know about Lovecraft's racism. I don't know that he's exceptionally racist. He's quite racist, but I don't know if he was exceptionally racist within the context of his time. Still is exceptionally racist for now. And so I don't want anyone to think that they have to read Lovecraft as much as I enjoy reading Lovecraft, right?
Definitely very vocal, especially in his letters and stuff like that.
Right. That's definitely
his
what
letters and his poetry. I think his racism really comes through. But building on what Hoy's talking about, when we were interested in starting the podcast, we were aware of the fact that a lot of people were coming to the appendix, and not in spite of its racism and misogyny, but almost kind of because of, like, this is back in a time when men were allowed to be men and we didn't have to worry about PC culture. A lot of people were saying things like that. And I remember, because of that, I wanted to be really clear with our listeners from the very beginning that that's not who we were. So we did an episode 0 of our show where we explained that, yes, we are reading these texts. We're not telling you not to read them because of the racism and misogyny you find in these texts. 2, we're not going to apologize for this stuff. We're always going to talk about it. But also 3, if you don't want to read the stuff, we're not going to tell you have to. Like, this is a personal choice, but we see value in exploring this stuff. But even despite that, the first review that we ended up getting once we got our podcast out was this really glowing, lovely review on a white supremacy blog.
Oh,
Wow.
How great our podcast is.
oh my God.
So we just knew we needed to be really careful with how we proceeded.
Wow.
Right. And then I think one of our first negative reviews was on Apple. The Apple podcast app was like, why should we be reading any of this stuff? It's like a 5e, and wasn't the username like 5e player or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Like, why do I want to read all this racist stuff? And it's like, okay, people, like, we're addressing all of this, but yeah.
I guess why is it important to read this? Why not just like completely discard it and read like more modern stuff, which is like more accommodating to people? Why bother even going back to this?
For me, I think it's really interesting to get an idea about, from the reason why it was important for me in terms of the Appendix N specifically, is I wanted to see what was going on in the brains of the people around the time that this stuff was created. And this statement I'm about to say is a hyperbolic statement. I don't really mean it, but I kind of do. But a thing that I've said a lot over the years is that Dungeons and Dragons ruined fantasy literature. And what I mean by that is I feel like prior to Dungeons and Dragons, you could read 2 different authors and they would have very different descriptions of what an elf is or what a dragon is. Or we had just very different ideas of what fantasy looked like. There could be a spaceship in a fantasy story, or you can hop into a rocket ship and go onto a planet and then fight a dragon with a sword. All of these things could, like, the fantasy and science fiction were much more limitless prior to D&D. And then when D&D came along and it got really popular, it really codified a lot of these kind of Tolkien tropes, and really kind of gave, from like, I think from like the late 70s onward, we then developed this really rigid idea of what fantasy looks like. And going back and reading this stuff from before that era is so freeing. Reading Conan the Barbarian and reading Elric and reading these like wild stories by like Margaret St. Clair. There's just really cool stuff out there that shows me that fantasy doesn't have to be the, five people with an elf and a hobbit and a dwarf going on an adventure to save the world from ending. It can just be a bunch of like, I don't know, lowlifes who are trying to steal a gem from a tower so that they can like go get drunk and just get through the next few days. Like I really enjoy that kind of stuff. What do you think, Hoy?
I definitely agree with everything that you've just said. From my standpoint, I think in my family, it's always just been, we're just very big on history. My dad was a historian. So I'm always really interested in where things come from and where we're going.
Yeah.
And, we talked about, I think on your most recent episode, you guys were talking to Dr. Gangrene. He was talking about a story that's like, oh, it's written 97 years ago, right? But when I started reading that, it wasn't 97 years ago. It was maybe 75 years ago, which is within living memory, right? Or for a lot of us, it's really fascinating for me to see these extrusions sticking up. Like, one of the problems with movies a lot of times, modern Hollywood movies, right? If they set them in the 1940s, then all the technology is from the 1940s, right? We have to get everything perfect. But that's not how we live, right? We live, and in our neighborhood, we have a building that's 80 years old or blah, blah, blah. So I really loved in the 70s, part of what people think was the 70s grime was we're seeing the 70s movies like The French Connection, right? It's showing New York in the 70s, but it's also showing New York from the 1920s because all the architecture and all the stuff like that is still showing through. So in that same way, these books are still showing through, even to hopefully to our more or less modern era. Lately, maybe there's a slight trend to sort of also, I want to say YA-ify, if that's the right word, fantasy fiction.
Yeah.
So
You understand,
yeah. Everybody has to be really nice. Maybe they're misunderstood. I mean, that's maybe a reaction to Grimdark, which also has its excesses. So I think things just have this pendulum and they go back and forth. But to me, I really like to see these extrusions. I'm also kind of really interested in things that are not immediately obvious, like the requirements of production will also dictate somehow things happen. So one of the things that we discovered is that the glue that they used to make paperbacks was nowhere near as good as it is now. So the books had to be a lot thinner. They could only be like 100, 240 pages or something like that. So you didn't get these huge doorstopper novels like you do now, right? So people were like a lot. And of course, a lot of that stuff was written originally for publication in the pulp magazine. So there were sort of like novellas, long short stories that would then be sort of slightly written to become a novel or a story collection. So I'm really fond of short stories also. I think that's a form that is unfortunately maybe not as marketable now.
Yeah.
But I think it's the best medium for horror. Lovecraft is mostly short stories, with the exception of Charles Dexter Ward, right? And for a lot of sword and sorcery, I think it works better in the short story format.
I think so too. And quickly building on one other thing that Hoy is talking about with the historical context, being a big nerd for the game, it's really fun reading stories and then seeing things in the text that you can tell Gary Gygax lifted this directly from. While reading the L. Sprague de Camp Harold Shea Incomplete Enchanter stories, Harold Shea is talking about how magic has 3 components: material, somatic, and verbal components. That's exactly how the spell components are separated in Dungeons and Dragons. So it's like, oh, okay, that's where Gary got that. Or we'll be reading, there's a book by
Jack Williamson.
Thank you, Jack Williamson, but it's darker than
you think.
Darker than you think. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a story about werewolves. But when you look through it, in that story, they have werebears, they've got werewolves, and the exact animals that they have as were creatures in that story are the exact were creatures that you see in the monster manual. So little things like that, or how Gary Gygax's favorite author is Jack Vance. And they talk about how in Dungeons and Dragons, magic is Vancian magic. And Gary Gygax got Jack Vance's permission to use the term Vancian to describe the magic. But in most fantasy worlds, wizards and witches, they either just know magic or they have to, talk to demons and figure things out. That's very kind of sword and sorcery style. But in the Dying Earth, you memorize a spell that the rune of that spell is imprinted into your brain. And then the moment you speak it, poof, it's gone. And that works so beautifully for a game. So it's not surprising that Gary would want to take this very gameable magic system and then apply that to his fantasy role-playing game. So it's also just, for a nerd like myself, really fun to see where this stuff comes from.
He also made a character in honor of Jack Vance, Vecna.
The Lich, and then of course Vecna is now back in people's minds because of Stranger Things season 4.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's fun to see this stuff sort of come full circle. I think at the moment this country is a strange country because it's a young country. So there's a tension in this country between, always looking forward and thinking like, oh, the past doesn't have anything to teach us. But, obviously the past has a lot to teach us, which is why people are trying to suppress it in a lot of places right now in education, right? So
Interesting.
and Lovecraft, people think of as a thing of the past, but he was a very contemporary. He was the first sort of modern. He was a modernist, right? He's writing science fiction. He's not writing, ghosts and clanking chains in the attic. I mean, he has a few of those things when he's working those things out in his early fiction, his juvenile fiction. But by the time he gets to, his great works when he comes back from New York, right after Horror at Red Hook, it's science fiction, right? Shadow Out of Time is science fiction. All these other ones are, Mountains of Madness is a techno thriller, right? Because they're talking about the most modern technology they had at the time, and they're talking about like, oh, we're exactly at this latitude, this longitude when we discover, this old one or whatever. And they're talking about everything is super scientific in there. So he's very, very modern in outlook.
It's amazing how progressive Lovecraft could be on certain things. He was like, he revamped the vampire story in The Shunned House.
Mm-hmm.
He did the things like that, and the fungi from Yawguf, have come from outer space. And other times they may come from from hell or something. But he added up.
Right, and he's basically talking about quantum mechanics and higher mathematics in The Dreams from the Witch House, which is the specific I mentioned before. That's the story that got me to tap out on Lovecraft for almost 10 years, because at that point I was living in this house, which was, I think, built in the 1840s, and I was living in the attic, and so everything was slanted, and it was all the weird things. So I kept thinking that Brown Jenkins was going to come out and sit on my chest and eat through my chest, and that's when I tapped out on Lovecraft for about 10 years until my mid-20s. But yeah, so he's.
Side note, that actually probably is my favorite Lovecraft story.
It's a great story. It's that, and Haunter of the Dark is great. I did mention Color Out of Space. The other reason that Color Out of Space really worked for me is because I know a lot of those places. I'm from Massachusetts, so the Quabbin Reservoir I'd gone to on school trips, and the Color Out of Space is buried under there somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So all those things, and I think that's where a lot of speaking of that, a lot of Lovecraftian authors fall down. They try to emulate Lovecraft directly, writing to write, but not realizing that should be writing to their own particular strengths. So Derleth should have been writing about the upper Midwest, but he was writing about New England, which he knows nothing about, right? So
yeah, I like his Wisconsin stories a lot better than when he's trying to write about New England.
Mm-hmm. So why I'm kind of a fan of, like, say, Michael Shea, who wrote the Niftaleen fantasy books, and he's written a lot of Lovecraftian fiction, and he just had an adaptation on that Guillermo del Toro series that was on Netflix.
Yeah. Cabinet Curiosity. The
autopsy. The autopsy, which is a great story. He was a sort of he was a very well-educated man, but he was also very working class. So he's writing about like the street people and the working class people in the Bay Area, and in his sort of Lovecraftian fiction, he writes about the Tenderloin, and he was, I think, a night clerk at one of those stuff like SRO hotels in San Francisco. So he's writing there to his strength, but bringing Lovecraftian horror in there. And so I think that, or cosmic horror, let's put it that way. And we talked about sort of in the pre-show about Larry Barron, again, writing to what he knows, or at least what he can connect with, right? And so I think that's important when you're doing anything, whether it's cosmic horror, any kind of fiction. Write what you know is a little trite, because obviously you could never write fantasy if that was the case, but you should find some way to connect to it. You have to work through your sort of imitation and pastiche phase, but then you should find something that's authentic to you and bring that to the fiction,
Well said. And so when y'all just started doing the podcast, did y'all have a rhyme or reason for what books you picked? It was like, you picked the first one for some specific reason, or was it completely random?
There you go.
We're laughing because I can be very so I want to say I can be very OCD, but I also, because I'm also a therapist, I just want to acknowledge that we tend to use mental health language colloquially in ways that actually aren't clinically accurate. But in the colloquial version, and the way that we say OCD colloquially, I have a tendency to be very OCD with spreadsheets. I like to have very involved spreadsheets for lots of things. And the way in which we ended up coming up with the order in which we went through the first 100 episodes was a very involved spreadsheet process that I used so that I could kind of evenly space the authors, but also cover all of the things that we needed to cover, where I also kind of more heavily weighted authors who also appeared not only in the Appendix N, but also in the 5th edition Appendix E. and also in the 1981 Holmes basic box set, they also had a list of recommended authors. So any of the authors who appeared on all
Mulvey basic.
Mulvey, I'm sorry, thank you. Mulvey. Holmes is the blue box before that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And any of the authors who appeared in all three of those, I kind of weighted more heavily. The ones who maybe only appeared on Gygax's list, I kind of weighted them less heavily. But kind of keeping all that in mind, I only was covering things that were found on those lists. In that first 100 episode, is only the things that were on that list, plus Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith is not technically on the Appendix N. Lots of people have theories about it. Some people think it was an oversight. Some people think Gygax didn't actually read Clark Ashton Smith. Some people say that's ridiculous. Of course, he read Clark Ashton Smith, but we think maybe his work was a little too perverse and adult, and he didn't want to have that included in the Appendix N. Who knows? But regardless, Clark Ashton Smith belongs there and is incredibly foundational in the development of the kind of fantasy that D&D was inspired by. So we also made sure to be including Clark Ashton Smith. But everything that we were covering for those first 100 episodes were things that were available in paperback form at the time that D&D was coming out. So if it had a paperback in America prior to 1979, that was kind of one of the main requirements for that.
I'm shaking my fist at Jeff because I was originally going to read all these in ebook and get them from the library, but then he started showing up with these paperbacks, and I'm like, I'm a sucker for like paperback art, cover art. Right.
And we both ended up accidentally getting in eBay bidding wars with each other without realizing it, and just driving up the price for the buyer. And we both ended up spending way more money than we've probably have ever made back from our Patreon on our initial stocking up of these books.
Right. And then the ultimate heresy of heresies was, Jeff, you sold your first 100 books there, right? And it
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else, because also people get very upset with me because as I go through the books, I highlight them so that I can
different color
go back and talk about them. So I'm defacing these vintage paperbacks. But my argument my argument for that is, with each of those paperbacks that I was defacing for the podcast so that I could then take the proper notes I wanted to and be able to go back to this stuff, my argument is that for each one that was sacrificed, I've turned so many other people onto these books that I feel like it ultimately is still a karmic positive.
Right. Whoever won that eBay bidding war for that lot has like a whole scholarly collection now. So
yeah, somebody has the first 100 books of our podcast and has my editions of them with my highlights and my notes in them.
Right.
Wow. It's added value.
Yeah, it may be an enhancement to them, more of a collectible,
There you go. So yeah. So I had to stop buying books for a while because I know it's like, okay, it's going to be another 5 or 6 years. But I have noticed since COVID, the prices on a lot of these books shot up. I mean, I think that a lot of people just have more time on their hands and they were sitting around. So they're books that were less than $10, when we started this project, are now going for $15, $20, depending on condition, on more. Clark Ashton Smith, the original Ballantine adult fantasy ones. I mean, they were already kind of pricey, but I was able to get all my copies for less than $12, but now they're hovering around $30 or more for copies in good shape, which is borderline criminal, frankly, but.
And I think part of that too is that I think the COVID quarantine is, I think, really hard on the mental health of a lot of people. So I think people started spending money on things that bring them joy.
Yeah.
So I think people started focusing more on collecting old RPG books or old paperbacks or vintage NES games or like whatever it is. People just started like collecting things that bring them joy and make them happy and put a smile on their face. Yeah. But because of that, people were, bidding against each other for these things.
And it also loses a little bit of the, we're all, I think of, I remember this of actually going to like flipping through the bins, whether it's for some vinyl or, trying to paperbacks 3 deep at a used bookstore and pulling them all out to see what's behind the first layer of paperbacks. So that sense of discovery now, I mean, you can get everything on the internet, but you have to pay, as long as you're willing to pay for it. So you lose a little bit of that. And then of course the people who are selling stuff are now much more cognizant of the market, the current market value of that stuff. So it's harder to find those really cool bargains. I don't begrudge anyone that, but obviously it makes life a little harder for me in that regard. So
You can't find those cheap discoveries anymore. They become like a priceless treasure for you.
Right.
It's hard.
Every once in a while, but yeah. Certainly,
I don't know if
especially-
you're aware of it, but there's a Facebook group called RPG Auctions.
Yeah.
They go, some of the things go insanely high on there, especially if they're like mint condition or unopened. It's unreal. The amount of money that those guys will spend on. Well, the Flame Princess. That's really evidently that's hard to get because people will bid a lot of money for those. So
it's true, and I am both proud of and embarrassed by. Well, I'm proud of my Judges Guild collection. I don't know if anybody here knows what Judges Guild is.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a just about complete collection of Judges Guild products.
Nice.
Which is a big undertaking, and I'm very proud of that, but I'm also a little embarrassed by how much money that ultimately to get, and how little I actually do with having. Now that I have that collection, I'm not doing a whole lot with it.
Okay. As you get to arm wrestle with Andy Action to see who has the most copies of everything. But I was actually very lucky to see. Also, last weekend I went up to what's now my aunt's house, but was the house I was living in in high school, and in that crawl space, in the Walter Gilman crawl space, not hundreds of baby bones, but I was able to pick out. I was able to find all the stuff my entire life before 1996. So, and in good shape too. So like 16 boxes of comics from the mid 80s, but
wow.
I didn't even look at the stuff. I just brought it over to my mom's house, but I did open one box and I found, mint copies of my Realms of Chaos supplements for Warhammer Fantasy. We're talking about stuff that's super expensive now. So they were still in good shape. My Deities and Demigods was not in good shape, but it wasn't in good shape even then because I used it so much. And there's definitely like pencil markings next to the stats for Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and stuff like that.
That's how you know it's a well-loved book.
Yeah, that one was definitely. I actually remember even like sort of, we didn't have like really good tape then, so I just remember like reinforcing some of the folder modules with like little like surgical tape along the spines. So I did like thumb through those quite a bit. So that was quite fun. And I think later in the summer I'll go up and look and see what I really have at that point. But
I heard y'all joke in one of y'all's podcasts that y'all have your episodes planned out to 2028 at least. Do y'all have really that planned out? For
we did before we changed the format. So for the first 100, so originally the goal was to have 290 episodes. And that was gonna cover everything we wanted to cover. That would have gone out that far out. But then by the 100th episode, I just said to Hoy, I'm like, I'm really getting burnt out with this. I really need to mix this up. And so we scrapped the rest of the list. And then at that point, that's when we moved it to any fiction that inspires our gaming. So now from episode 100 on, we've been covering contemporary stuff and Appendix N and classic stuff that's not featured on those lists. And so at this point, we don't really have anything planned except for what our patrons have already voted on, which I believe is still now through the end of December. So we still have the rest of the year planned out, but we're no longer planning ahead more than a decade in advance.
All right. Yeah. And we did slightly slow down too this year. And that's why we were talking about sort of in the pre-show now that we have the movie club for our patrons. So we're now sort of averaging a book a month instead of a book every 2 weeks, which was kind of brutal because there was definitely times when I was reading the book right up till the time of recording. And so now, yeah, it's like I'm one of those people who like reads, like I can be like super intense, but then I might be like off for like 3 days where I'm not touching a book. It's just how life works. And then I'm also one of the people who always has to read a book in between every book. So it was becoming, I mean, Jeff, you talked about it, right? It was becoming, you never want it to become a chore because we want the enthusiasm for the material to always shine through, right?
And I've never been a fast reader. So part of the reason we needed to change the frequency too is, I mean, for 6 years, it was literally basically all I was reading, except I also went to grad school during that too. So it was my grad school reading and Appendix N and nothing else.
So what was the first non-Appendix N book that y'all read for the podcast?
It was Amaro by Charles R. Saunders.
He's I don't know, for your listeners, he was a African-American author. Amaro was very much influenced by the sort of Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, but he was saying, I want to write a black character who has all these attributes and reclaim sort of the sort of African, it's fictionalized version of sword and sorcery Africa. And then he actually ended up, I think, moving to Toronto and then later on Nova Scotia to because he was protesting the Vietnam War. He just passed away very recently. Yeah,
one of his stories. He did like a Lovecraftian fiction story.
he did.
I can't remember the name of it to save my life.
It's online. I have read it, and it's sort of about the repercussions of slavery. He's a terrific writer, and he sadly was sort of overlooked towards the end of his career. And I think there's people trying to, bring him back into the public consciousness, but I don't know what the situation is with the rights to his stuff and like that is. So fortunately, I have some of his stuff, but there's still some stuff out there that's not, easily to get. And at a point, there was stuff on Lulu you could get like print on demand, but the last 2 books in that series have been taken off. So I'm sure they're just sorting out, what the rights are at the moment for that.
Charles L. Saunders isn't somebody who you should check out just because he was a black author in the 70s, right?
No, absolutely not.
Sorcery, like his stuff really is phenomenally cool. And if you want to read sword and sorcery that takes place instead of in a Eurocentric place setting, that takes place in an Afrocentric fictionalized world, it's really, really fascinating and really well written.
Right, very well written, and I think he touches on a theme that is sort of anti sword and sorcery while still being a sword and sorcery, which is that Imaro exists in community. He's an outcast, but the whole thing he's striving for is community, and that sort of goes against sort of the idea of the lone gunslinger, the lone swordsman, that kind of stuff like that mythology that we have in a lot of American heroic fiction. And so that I think was a very powerful thing that he was trying to do.
I have him on my list to read. He had like I don't know if you say like a barbarian-like character that he created, and I think he had like a few stories about him.
Yeah, that's Imaro.
That's
and
Imaro.
Then, yeah. But he also did some other ones, which are, I think he had another character who she was sort of like the what's the kingdom in West Africa that they just did that movie about, the barbarian king, Dahomey. And so he had a character who was like a woman warrior also. And I think he did 1 or 2 books about that, and he also wrote a lot of pulp, contemporary fiction, and I don't know how many Lovecraftian stories he wrote, but that one that you were mentioning, I forget the title for me. It's completely out of my head, but it's a good one.
I think it was like someone's name. It was,
But like if you look at our list, episode 100 was still Appendix N, and episode 110 was an Appendix N title. But from 101 to 109, none of them were Appendix N. Like we covered Amaro, we covered Michael Shea's Nephilim, we did Titus Groan, Clive Barker's Books of Blood, The Man Who Was Thursday, Jarell of Joiry, Swords Point, The Shadow of the Torturer, and A Wizard of Earthsea. So like a lot of really cool, interesting stuff that absolutely I think needs to be talked about in a space like this, but would not have gotten attention if we were exclusively focusing on the list that Gary gave us.
By the way, it's Jeroboam Henley's Debt, I think it's the story.
So what was it called?
Jeroboam Henley's Debt. Does that sound like the story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 minute.
Is the library open today?
Yeah. But I have listened to just a few of your episodes, the most recent one and the first episode, and not your and a little bit of the Larry Barron episode. But you guys have gotten some real heavy hitters. So you've gotten S.T. Joshi, you've gotten Robert Price, and how do you guys go about sort of making those connections out there?
I just reach out to them. With Josie, I kind of like if I had a question, and so I like emailed him the question I had about it, and he answered it for me. And when they started releasing the book of letters, I was asking how like a book of a master index for all the letters, so that way I can just like go to that one source instead of like going through all the books trying to figure out, what Lovecraft talked about in them, and he didn't. But he gave me a copy of the indexes, so I've kind of combined them together so I can do like a master index.
There you go
for that. And so, but that's a bit since I was such a community of him, I decided I'm just making him a guest on the show.
There you go.
And so
we've had some opportunities, but we've also been sort of a little careful. We were very lucky to have Michael Moorcock on the show, and that took some work that Jeff did a lot. But we're also like, sometimes it's maybe better not to meet your heroes.
Yeah.
But with Michael Moorcock, he was great. He was amazing.
Yeah, Michael Moorcock is an exception to the never meet your heroes saying. He was phenomenal and really cool to have on the show.
I was wondering to ask you all your next questions, like how do y'all get y'all's guests? You know, do y'all like decide like you know somebody be really perfect to talk about this book with, or what?
It's a mix of things. Sometimes it's that. Um, Also, sometimes it's like, let's get some heavy hitters in here. But initially, since I'm very actively involved in the Dungeon Crawl Classics Goodman Games world, I know a lot of those folks. And initially, we just had a lot of those people on. But then I realized we were getting a lot of a very specific kind of perspective. So I also just started reaching out to people who I'm not really connected with, getting people from like the story game world and getting people from kind of who are more interested in fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons, getting people from all over the hobby. So yeah, and sometimes it's just kind of like, oh, me or Hoy like come across somebody who seems interesting and we decide to reach out to them. Sometimes I'm just poking around on Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, we got also really lucky because yeah, like on Twitter, we mentioned that we were reading a book by Ellen Kushner, and then Jeff likes to put up a screenshot of the cover, and she says that's the correct cover, and so thumbs up back, and then that eventually worked out to her coming on the show to talk about her Ursula K. Le Guin book, Wizard of Earthsea, and then she recommended a couple other authors. So this is people who are not even connected to gaming but are into are fantasy authors. So we've had a little bit of that, which has been amazing.
I did feel bad for Ellen Kushner though. So when she came on, we had already recorded the episode about her book but hadn't released it yet. And unfortunately, the guest we had on for the Ellen Kushner book did not like her book at all and was not gentle about it.
Oh, wow.
So then I felt really bad having her on later when like she hadn't heard her own episode yet for her to discuss a Wizard of Earthsea. And of course, like we were all like really excited about a Wizard of Earthsea. But because like because the guest wasn't a huge fan of her book, we also have, before we record each episode, we have a conversation we have with our patrons about the same book, and we record that and we release that just for our patrons. But since that was such a positive conversation, we also decided to release that patron book club as a part of our regular stream as well, so that we can have also some more positive perspectives on her book.
Although we do have a running joke, or at least I have a running joke every once in a while, that we strive to find the absolute worst fit between guest and book, which is I mean, we have a tough road to hoe in some ways, because we're actually asking our guests to come on and do homework, right? And for no recompense, right? Like we're asking you to read a 200-page book or whatever, just for the love of coming on and blathering about to two nerds for an hour, right?
Well, and soon we're going to be covering Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So soon we're going to be asking somebody to
read 800 pages.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Wow. Yeah.
But mostly it's been very positive, and you know, people will just say no if they can't do it. And we've only had like one or two people who've ghosted us for reasons, whatever reason. You know, it would have been better if they just said, "I thought we could do it, and I can't." But you know, that is what it is. So,
one of my favorite episodes that y'all did was like for the case of Charles Dexter Ward. And I must admit, when I first saw this episode, I thought it was a little strange because I just couldn't picture how Charles Dexter Ward and Dungeons and Dragons fit together. But after hearing it, I can't see anything else but Dungeons and Dragons. And I thought that was really amazing, the insight y'all provided for that one.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. And David Beatty, the guy who was our guest for that, is really big into Lovecraftian fiction and is behind a game called Weird Frontiers, which was originally called Dark Trails when he was on that episode. And it's all like Lovecraftian, Western horror weirdness.
Right. Using the DCC engine, which is really fascinating. Yeah. And because I hadn't read that story in a long time, and then I was looking back at it, said, yeah, this is very Dungeons and Dragons. We have this like large party going in. This is a dungeon, right? There's these things in the pits, right? And so you could see that there was that's the strain that's maybe missing from modern incarnations of D&D. Is the sort of the horror, the survival horror. Fifth edition is very much more overtly heroic. I mean, and they've got a couple of sort of horror supplements, but that to me is more like sort of the universal horror ride, not even the universal horror movies. And that's not to denigrate that. Sometimes you want the thrill, but knowing that you'll ultimately be safe. But that's not the case in first edition Dungeons and Dragons and early RPGs, right? Your characters might have a limited shelf life. And then particularly Call of Cthulhu, that's the only game where your characters actively get worse, right? So
I like one of the references y'all made during that episode. You're talking about like adding a sanity check, to the campaigns. That's definitely very true. For a Lovecraft story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it's interesting, and Jeff, maybe you could talk about this or not, but I know that there's a lately occurrent tendency people are talking about because we're much more aware of mental health and language around mental health. People are like, I don't know if the sanity check is the real thing. But to me, that was such an original mechanic, right? That was the quintessential thing that Call of Cthulhu, that game, and so, now there's a fear mechanics. A lot of games have these stress mechanics, but if it hadn't started with the sanity mechanic in Call of Cthulhu, I don't think we would have had a lot of those mechanics until later. But now there's a current tendency to say, no, we should get rid of that because it's stigmatizing mental illness and all that stuff like that. But I feel like this is something beyond, what we understand of as mental illness. But again, we have to use precise with the language, right? So we shouldn't just say, schizophrenia when we're talking about something else, or this person is blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I'm not as up on that, but
yeah, I'm not super eager to throw my hat too much in the ring on this topic, but I would say that in general, I think conversations around that, conversations around cultural appropriation, conversations around decolonizing RPGs, all of these kinds of conversations I think are interesting and helpful and things that we should really think about and use to expand our own thinking. And I don't think any one person is in possession of the one right way to handle any of these things. And I think a lot of it is figuring out who we're playing with and also trying to be as mindful as we can and asking ourselves, would I still use the same kind of language and these same kind of ideas, regardless of who is here? So if I did have like a character, if I had a player at my table who I know has had a history of mental health struggles, would I be talking about this thing the same way if they were there as if they weren't there? That might be something worth asking myself. But in general, is it okay or not okay to have something like a sanity check in an RPG? That's not really up to me to say, but I will say I play games with sanity checks and I'm not offended by it.
Right.
I see more of the sanity check. I guess the insanity is more like, you go like, you just flee in terror. You're so full of terror, you kind of like flee away from the action.
Or maybe it's even how bad is your PTSD now?
Yeah.
Right.
It just gets progressively worse.
The descriptions in the original first edition, and Jeff, you just got the reprint editions, right? Of first edition Call of Cthulhu, right? So the descriptions of all the phobias are both a little bit tongue in cheek, and they're all these phobias you've never heard of. So I could see how someone who is, more attuned to that might think that they're borderline offensive, but I think that they're hilarious. And these are phobias that like no one's ever likely to actually have, because it's like specifically a phobia of like, I don't know, not black cat, but a black cat with like a left rear paw that's white or something. I don't know. And they're very but again, we have words like, we're just thinking about the colloquial use of OCD or the colloquial use of the word schizophrenia and stuff like that versus what it actually means to people. So again, we have to, as Steph was saying, be mindful, but not to the point where you sort of constantly feeling like you're in a box or self-censoring. I think that's a thing that's hard to do, especially if you're trying to run a game. Is how can we do this without not stepping on eggshells, but also being a good person doing.
Also, no matter how you do it, there's going to be a big group of people who are going to tell you you're doing it wrong.
Right.
So if you're trying to make everybody happy, that is not a realistic expectation, and you're going to fail.
Right. So yeah, ultimately, I'm not concerned about the people online or whatever. I'm just concerned with the people who are immediately in my presence at my game, right? And obviously, it changes when you're at conventions or people that you don't know as well, and that's why we have these things like discussion of stuff like safety tools and stuff like that, which. Even if you don't specifically use that specific tool, being mindful of what they are intended to do or intended to help with, right? But like I haven't used anything specifically, but I'll try to keep an eye on it too. It's like, oh, is this too much? Like I like to have my combat scenes a little bit gory, as I describe them. But I would just take a look. It's like, oh, is this too much? Okay, let me dial it back a little bit. So.
I will say though, my biggest pet peeve with Call of Cthulhu players is, and again, they fall into different camps, but the first time I got into a Call of Cthulhu campaign, it was with a bunch of people I'd never played with before. I think I found them through Craigslist when I was living in New York, and I was really excited. And I get there, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that over half of the game time was spent arguing over and Googling whether or not a lighter existed in 1921,
Yeah.
arguing about whether or not motorboat, like rowboats with motors, were a thing or not, and being so like obsessed with being super accurate to the era. And I get that for some people, that's their way of playing and that's their way of having fun. For me, that's not fun. I'm just like, let's who cares if it's historically inaccurate? Let's just have a good time.
Right. And which is, I think, why Delta Green was kind of liberating, because it was set in the present day when it came out. So you could just talk about things that people were kind of familiar with.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately almost as if it would have been easier if the game had been like set in the 1890s. People would have less arguments about that. But the 20s, again, we were talking about before, was almost within living memory. And so people feel like they're like, oh, my grandmother told me that they didn't have, Chris Craft motorboats that year. What are you talking about? Right.
But that's the thing that's fun about like D&D and D&D like games, is they don't take place in the year 1200 in our world. It's just kind of a big mishmash of all kinds of stuff. We've got some Renaissance culture in there. We've got some Bronze Age stuff in there. Who cares? Have fun.
Yeah, it's all one big time mess.
Yeah.
I can just that's probably one of the fun things about Dungeons and Dragons. You kind of cherry pick what you want to have in there.
Yeah.
But you probably get a lot of flack, like trying to throw in a spaceship or something, unless you want to throw in ancient astronauts or something.
Well, I mean, that's what's great about original first edition Dungeons and Dragons, though, because they didn't mind getting their peanut butter and their chocolate, right? I mean, there's the famous module, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, right? Beside a spaceship, and now people, as Jeff was saying, people are much more like, this is fantasy, this is science fiction.
Yeah.
And not only is this fantasy, it's a lot of it. This is heroic fantasy as opposed to grimdark. And I think these are all useful terms to sort of say, okay, well, we're talking about things that are slightly different, but to just say, oh, and I only do this thing in this mode or this register, as opposed to this register, I think is very limiting and not as fun.
And even in 1974, when Dungeons and Dragons first came out, it came out in this little box with 3 little booklets in it. And in that original incarnation of Dungeons and Dragons, there's a list of the monsters that you can have in your games, and robots are one of the monsters on there.
But we need to have that when we're campaigning.
No, it says right here.
Yeah.
The original source material has robots.
Yes.
Right.
Although in that original source, there was no thief. There were only 3 classes: human. I'm sorry, not human. Fighting man, magic user, and
cleric. Yeah.
Wow.
I guess presumably everyone was a thief at that point. A lot of people say you mark the downfall of Dungeons and Dragons as with the introduction of the thief class. I don't agree, because I think the thief is a real archetype in the fiction. I mean, we have the Mouser, we have Jack of Shadows, a bunch of other characters. And what's the Clark Ashton Smith stories we love with the thief? It's Satan Prazeros. No, it's Satan Prazeros. So there is a literary precedent for the thief, although a lot of people say, oh no, there's no such thing. But I think
much more of one than there is for the cleric.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of good thief stories out there.
Yeah. Whereas the cleric is maybe just like Van Helsing, and people wanted someone who could just, fend off a vampire. I guess Solomon Kane might borderline be a cleric, from the Robert E. Howard fiction, if you're looking at that, And
I don't know how in the weeds we want to get with this stuff, but do you kind of know why this stuff happened, and do we care about it on this particular podcast?
No, go ahead. Say it.
So a lot of people like to say Gary Gygax created D&D, and that's not super accurate.
Right.
So Gary Gygax was a miniature war gamer, and was really into that stuff. And I forget, Ahoy, did he co-create Gen Con, or did he just go there?
I think he did co-create Gen Con, but I'm not going to swear to that.
Yeah. I think he did. And so he's at Gen Con, which is a miniature wargaming convention. And he ends up creating his own little miniature war game that he's releasing for sale called Chainmail. And in the back of Chainmail, there's this little section for if you want to use these rules for like fantasy wars, if you want to do like the battle at Helm's Deep or something, this is how you could do that. A dude named Dave Arneson buys Chainmail, takes it back to his miniature wargaming group, and they think it's really cool. And they have the idea, what if instead of each of us playing an army, we use these chainmail rules to each play a person? And instead of us battling each other, let's all like go on an adventure together and go through a dungeon. And they ended up doing this and they loved it and they had a great time. And like one of the characters was a vampire and another one was like a vampire hunter and all this kind of stuff. And then the next Gen Con, Dave Arneson went up to Gary Gygax and is like, "Oh, we are doing the coolest thing with your chainmail rules. Let me tell you about it." And Gary's like, "That sounds amazing. We should turn that into a game." And that's where Dungeons and Dragons came about. And it's Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. But because of that, it's also a mishmash of a lot of their ideas. And a lot of people think that the reason why the cleric class is there is kind of because of some of this stuff that was happening in the Dave Arneson campaign.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's some other precedents to D&D, like Castle Braunstein and stuff like that. But it was really sort of like in a ferment. And I feel like it's hard to say whether, like, a lot of things will happen just because it's their time, although it might be specifically attached to somebody. I don't know if RPGs necessarily would have happened just because it was their time, or if they did and there was no Gygax or conversely no Arneson, they might have taken a different form. I know that Gary Gygax per se seems like he was not actually into Tolkien that much. No. But he felt like he had to include all the stuff because that was so popular at the time as a marketability thing. So if he had his druthers, it might have been more of a Conan or John Carter kind of game, right? Rather than, you know.
In those original booklets, not only do you have robots, you also have hobbits, not halflings, hobbits. Yeah. You have Nazgul. You have Ents.
Balrog.
You've got a Balrog, and Balrogs are singular, or like there could be Balrogs. Or there could be Medusas as well.
Right. So and then I think they got a cease and desist from Tolkien Estate. Same thing. He actually had a Warrior John Carter game that was sort of using the same engine, and they got a cease and desist too at that point. And so that's why there's no John Carter role playing game. That was the other thing I got from the editor, though, that you had mentioned on the pre-show, getting those D&D books. He also gave me the SPI John Carter, because they're distributing SPI too at the time. John Carter, I guess it's a war game, but it was, let's see what we call it. Right. So I remember that. I don't know where that is now at this point, though, but I remember it having some really nice cover art. So, but it took me years and years. I still haven't read it. Actually, I think that's our next book. I still actually have not read a John Carter book. I've read other Burroughs books, but I have not actually read it.
So. I love the John Carter books. I have not read them all. I think I read like the first three, and I keep wanting to go back and like reread them again because I just, as a kid in middle school, I loved them.
Yeah. The next one we're covering is A Princess of Mars, and I'm very excited. I'm already partway through it. I'm really enjoying
it. Yeah. So.
Talking about some of the other authors on the Appendix N, there's one on the list I've actually met before, Andre Norton.
Ooh. Oh, wow. Yeah.
She had a library in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. High Halleck, I think was the name of it. And I visited her library twice, and I actually had a camera one time. Someone had a camera, and we filmed her and everything in the library, and I have no idea what happened to that footage. I've been trying to find it, and it's like missing.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
What a cool.
Here's like a research that she had to do, like writers' retreats, or let people use the space for writers' retreats or something like that, and research. That was the
she had a base. I think it was her collection, all of the books that she used for like her research and everything, and she had like fiction, nonfiction, and just like kind of like really quirky books.
Yeah,
and so you just go through there. It was like a really big. I was like say it was like a warehouse, but it was a pretty big building, and it's like all these shelves of books and everything.
Yeah,
I'm definitely like to revisit her stuff because so far we've only read like the first 2 or 3 S-Carp books, right, and not the other continent in the Witch World series, as I recall, right, Jeff?
Yeah. So far I think we've only read 3 of them. Yeah, 3. We've read up through 3 against Witch World.
Yeah,
and another writer that I found to be surprising on the Appendix N was Gardner Fox. I always associate him with comic books, and so I didn't realize, he wrote fantasy books and very interesting fantasy books, I have to say.
Yeah.
Kothar the Barbarian is a lot of fun. Total schlock, but super fun.
Yeah. But Gardner Fox, creator, star of The Conqueror, right? And among others. And he wrote those Hawkman, the Silver Age Hawkman revival, right?
Right.
Yeah. Also, he wrote a ton of spy smut.
Yeah.
It was like the girl from Lust or something.
The lady from Lust and Cherry Delight, I think is the other character.
Oh wow.
I have to make mention to the Kentuckian on the list, Stanley Weinbaum. So he was I really enjoyed those episodes because I think like one of the people you got had never read Weinbaum before, and he was just like super into him afterwards. You know, he
I
just
think
like
that was the episode we did with Newton Nitro, right? From the
yes,
Brazilian. Yeah, that was a very good episode. He was very, very smart, man. We do have to read some Carl Edward Wagner at some point, who's Kentuckian too, right? I believe, or is that or is he Tennessean?
I don't know about him. I have to
Yeah.
look him up. Make sure.
And then Andrew Offutt's from your neck of the woods as well too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we got that, and then like, and I did notice that Gary Gygax also mentioned Bram Stoker as an influence, but he didn't include him in the Appendix N.
He did not, yeah. But although he did include him, because he specifically did say that he was an influence, he was on that list of 290 books that we would have eventually read.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll read Dracula at some point. I mean, I've read it a couple of times, but the interesting when you're reading Dracula is the mix of like Victorian sentimentality, but also modernity, because it's also a techno thriller, because they're using like telegraphs and the trains and train schedules, everything that was like currently state of the art in 1890. You know, so it's I think it's always interesting to look at these things because a lot of times they're not what you think they are. So the original Dracula is not like Bela Lugosi. It's not, you know, it's, and, you know, well, we did read Frankenstein earlier, right? And that's not, I mean, I love Boris Karloff, but it's not Boris Karloff, right?
Right. Yeah, and what's funny is Frankenstein wasn't on our original list, and we have since covered that, and Dracula was on the original list, and we have not yet covered that.
Yeah.
Funny how it all works. There was another book I've heard that's supposed to be an inspiration for Dungeons and Dragons called The Egypt Game by Zafo Ketley Snyder. If I said that right and all that.
No,
I've never heard of that. But I do know that in addition to these other authors, H. Rider Haggard. Wait, what is his name?
H. Rider Haggard.
H. Rider Haggard. Yeah, he that was a big influence for Gary Gygax as well.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
And then he also covered people like William Gibson, who didn't necessarily influence Dungeons and Dragons, but he influenced another type of role-playing game, Shadowrun.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right. I mean,
we recently covered Neuromancer.
Right. Yeah, I think we'll at some point there was enough of a positive reaction that I think that we'll be looking at some of the other first wave cyberpunk authors at some point, like George Alec Effinger and Neil Stevenson, sort of on the tail end of the first wave. But I mean, yeah, he's obviously huge. But it's really up to. It's sometimes we get these very surprising, like we'll put up the list, and then the people who actually the vote will go and break in a very surprising way, right? I think what's one of the ones that's really surprised you, Jeff? I think it was some of the movie ones were really surprising too,
Yeah, but I remember having a Princess of Mars early on, and something I really didn't expect to won, but I don't remember what that was.
Yeah. And then sometimes it'll be
I think the Jewel in the Skull was up against Princess of Mars, and I just assumed Princess of Mars would win, but Jewel in the Skull won.
Right. I think people are very, very well. We have a strong listenership in the UK and British Isles, so Moorcock always swings pretty heavily if they're. And for some, we have also a decent Brazilian audience, in as much as there's an Anglophone Brazilian audience.
We do.
And for a while, we're getting some, I think, on our map of listeners, although I don't know if we've ever talked to any of them. We had some, Polish or Czech, Eastern European listeners. It seemed like we're showing up in like sort of the sites where people were listening to, but I don't think we've ever interacted with any of our listeners from that area of the world.
Interesting. And a few other names I wanted to kind of cover is like you've covered Octavia Butler and Neil Gaiman.
Mm-hmm.
So you definitely go very, like contemporary and
since episode 100 we have been,
right. N.K. Jemisin was another very contemporary author. We covered her.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, have you ever been tempted to like read some of the Dungeons and Dragons books?
Oh yeah,
Forbidden Realms, and like and critique them for like the podcast.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll do. I'm sure we'll do Quiet Keep at some point, just because it's like the first official Dungeons and Dragons tie-in.
It's been whatever Drizzt Doran or whatever.
Sure. Or maybe a Dragonlance book. But I mean, ultimately, we're sort of maybe at the mercy of we'd have to like put together like a poll that was like all Dungeons and Dragons books, and then someone would vote on that. Because if you just slip one into like a poll that's otherwise, the theme is something else, but happens to have a Dungeons and Dragons tie-in, chances are, in my mind, I think it won't win. But our guests could surprise us because they might be like, "Oh yeah, I really want to read that Dragonlance book to see what like the state of D&D was in 1985." But
so we've been talking about Dungeons and Dragons, the game. What do y'all think about Dungeons and Dragons, the movie? The new one just came out.
It's funny you asked that. everybody assumed I wanted to see this movie, and I didn't. I didn't care about it. I had no interest in seeing it. And not because like I don't know. The only reason I don't really care about Dungeons and Dragons lore. I love the game. I love the collaborative storytelling. I love getting together with friends and rolling dice and things like that. But like the actual lore of D&D, especially of really current D&D with like Dragonborn and tieflings and like all this other, it's just aesthetically not something I care about. I don't really care about the Forgotten Realms either. So when I saw it was coming out, I was like, whatever. I don't need to see this. But I kept hearing from people it was really good. So I watched it and yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it.
I admit I have not seen it yet. I do have a Paramount Plus subscription, so it just dropped on Paramount Plus. So it's actually on my list for this week. But this week I actually have to do something else, which is watch all of the Willow miniseries because I know that Disney's taking it off at the end of the week, which is shameful because of this whole they don't want to pay residuals during the midst of this WGA strike. So they're trying to like basically write down this thing, which has been only on the service for like 6 months. They're going to write it down for take a $200 million loss just so they don't have to pay all sorts of various corporate taxes this year, which is it's just shameful because people put nobody sets out, even if a show or a book is flawed, nobody sets out to make stuff that's terrible. And when you think about how many people are involved in a production, even the smallest film, we're talking about a couple of dozen, even like an independent student film, right? So we're talking about a major miniseries. We're talking about 600, 700, 800 people who put a year or more of their lives into this. That's at the actual production level, let alone the getting it off the ground, however many years it took to get the series off the ground and greenlit. So I'm very sympathetic with the current WGA strikers. There's a weird thing going out there where people are out there like, no, they shouldn't go on strike because I need my stories. I'm like, dude, there will be no more stories if they don't get paid what they're paid because they'll just be replaced by AI soon. And, we'll all just be eating mush. So I'm very sympathetic to what's going on with the WGA. And it sounds like the Screen Actors Guild might go on and the DGA might go on strike too, because I think their contracts are expiring. And it's real work. I mean, I was a film major. It's not consistent work, but it's real work. It's nothing more tiring. I shouldn't say nothing more tiring. Being on a physical movie set is extremely tiring, and is physical work, especially if you're in the trades like, the gaffer or grip departments or production design. It's all
being a carpenter, putting up sets and everything.
Exactly. And even the actors. I mean, you have the actors, or the stand-ins for the actors, you're just they're being lit, under hot lights for hours and hours at a time. So, let's, props to them. We're not owed this.
All righty. We'll wrap it up on that note. But I do want to do with the our word of the word for the episode, and it's Hygaxian. It's a word that y'all keep mentioning all the time. What is a Hygaxian?
Well, so that's people talk about high Gygaxian, and high Gygaxian language is just really pompous language that Gary Gygax likes to use in his writing. And you see lots of very pompous high Gygaxian words in the Appendix N. And in a very early episode, I accidentally said Hygaxian and it cracked me up. And so we just kept saying it.
Yeah. So,
Nice.
right,
Like
so
that.
yeah, we said the Hygaxian word of the week. And it's surprising though. So every once in a while we're like, I mean, we usually have like a surplus of requirements, but every once in a while we're like, wait, we didn't find one this week. But our listeners have been very good, the patrons. So a lot of times I'll go with a suggestion from one of our patrons. So it's always fun. It's
I first thought that maybe Gary Gygax had an odd pronunciation for his name. I've been pronouncing it wrong all these years, and so it's supposed to be Hygax.
Nope, it is it's the contraction of high Gygaxian.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
Okay. Anyway, David and Richard and the rest of the gang, I see the stars are longer right. We must cease all discussions until they align again next month. 30 plus minutes of H.P. Lovecraft is sponsored by Appendix A, who is jealous that no one pays attention to him. This podcast was created in association with the LovecraftPod.com and the Logan Spector Fiction Group, with the help of the Logan County Public Library and the Great Old Ones. Special thanks to Katie Tysons for being the 20 on our dice roll, and Joshua Dukes for the other name being Helmet. Until we meet again, Princess Cthulhu wants you to know that the library is now closed.